Welcome back to On the Move with Victor Shi. It is Wednesday, February 8th, and today I'm coming to you less than 24 hours after President Biden delivered his second State of the Union speech to Congress. And I'm just going to say, I think personally, it was one of the best and most strong speeches that President Biden has delivered yet. It was forceful, it was honest, it called out Republicans, and really offered a clear vision of what is ahead. Today, we're going to dissect the State of the Union and how it's going to land on the public. And to help me do that, I'm joined by the wonderful Charlie Sykes, who is the editor-in-chief of the Bulwark, MSNBC political commentator, and author of How the Right Lost Its Mind, which seems truer than ever before now. Charlie, it's so great to see you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's get right in. One of the biggest challenges I thought for President Biden yesterday wasn't so much getting Congress's support, but instead getting the American people's support. There was this ABC poll released earlier in the week that showed more than 60% of voters didn't even know what President Biden had accomplished, which was nonetheless concerning. But I'm wondering, after hearing his speech and after he delivered it, what are your top line takeaways? Do you think that he was able to reach those voters who maybe haven't felt like the policies he's implemented apply to their life?
Well, I mean, the good news is that it was a pretty strong performance by the president. I thought that he was at his best when he was responding to the heckling, which was kind of interesting. The unscripted Joe Biden was awfully impressive, and it was I think a surprisingly impressive speech. And I say that as somebody that has been critical in the past of his speaking and of his messaging, that he has not been able to cut through. He has not sufficiently used his bully pulpit, which we can talk about before. But that was an interesting moment. The Republicans gave him a gift by turning themselves into boorish props for the State of the Union address. But to your question, the answer is probably not yet. We sometimes in the political pundit world, we tend to focus too intensely on one speech, and very rarely does one speech move the needle in any way, in part because the people he needed to reach were probably not sitting at home in their living rooms watching that speech. On the other hand, what he's doing is he is, I think, road testing the message. And he's road testing a message of some pretty, well, there's two areas. I mean, number one, he's road testing a lot of very popular proposals. But he also has to remember that he needs to tell that story over and over and over again. And this is something that we also, often forget. There's a reason why, radio stations used to play the same songs again and again and again. It was called playing the hits because you can't just say it once. And I think this White House has been under the impression that if you say something once, it's done, and it's not. But an interesting moment, if you wanted to draw a contrast between his leadership and the folks who are running Congress right now, last night was a very, very effective moment.
So, you mentioned the audience that President Biden had to reach, and I totally agree with you. There's many conversations right now about the State of the Union and how it can use some revamping for a 21st century. And yesterday, the other podcast I co-host, we had on Lawrence O'Donnell, who talked about just this, cable news network. If every single cable news channel aired and streamed the State of the Union, it would only reach about 40 million people max. And so the audience that you're trying to reach just isn't there. But I'm wondering, for maybe, I don't know, the audience that President Biden wants to reach, what will get that message to them? Is it, replays on social media? Is it replays on cable news? What will get that message to more people now post State of the Union?
Well, you probably can answer that question better than I can. But clearly, you're going to have to use 21st century techniques as opposed to using the techniques that would have been effective, say, in 1911, which is standing up on a podium. And it's funny you should mention that, because I was thinking about what an effective State of the Union speech would be going forward to accomplish what you just suggested. Remember what this will sound like a digression. Remember what the January 6th committee did? As opposed to having just stayed normal congressional hearings, they decided to put on a television show. They decided to make it into a documentary. And at some point, some president is going to say, all right, I'm going to discuss the State of the Union, and I'm going to make it multimedia. I'm going to
Mm.
show the jobs. I'm going to show the progress. I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to have charts. I'm going to have visuals. Because you're going to have to find a way to break through. One of the things about America today is that we have tens of millions of Americans who are completely disengaged from these issues. So they're the hardest to reach. Secondly, we have tens of millions of Americans who live in an alternative reality. So you and I were watching last night, watching Marjorie Taylor Greene screaming at the president, and we're thinking this is a pretty good night for Joe Biden. There's the other America that looks at that and says, boy, that Marjorie Taylor Greene, she was great. They think that was effective. So you have to reach the people who are not engaged and then figure out, how do you break through these alternative reality silos on Fox News? And I think the honest answer for you, Victor, is I don't think you can break through the alternative reality silos, but maybe you can reach those voters who are not engaged on a regular basis. And you're going to have to be very, very creative in doing that. And standing up at a podium in Congress is necessary, but it's far from sufficient.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the biggest questions, is whether or not we can reach that Fox News audience. And I'm becoming increasingly convinced that you probably can't, because they're so ingrained in kind of what they've been told from Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity. But I want to circle back to something you said in the first answer, which is the phraseology and the messaging that Biden should be using now. And there seemed to be this really interesting use of the phrase "finish the job." And Heather Cox Richardson last night, I was going through her Twitter page, and she, I thought, put it really well last night when she said that it's kind of a misleading quote, because it's actually a powerful call to complete a new direction for this country. And I'm wondering what you make of that phraseology, and whether or not it's an effective way, if that is the kind of phrase that he chooses, "finish the job," is going to be effective in terms of reaching and kind of offering this new vision for the American people.
Well, it's one of the phrases. I think that there are others as well, but I think what it does capture is that he's serious about getting things done, in contrast with a style of politics that is utterly uninterested in government, that is more performative. And it's like, okay, we've accomplished some things, but it's not done. And that's the tricky thing for Joe Biden, is to say, look at all these things we've done, but I'm not saying that things are really, really great. It's a dilemma for him. Now, Donald Trump didn't have this because he was post-shame. So he would just simply say, take credit for anything that happened, and then say everything is absolutely wonderful. It is just completely perfect. Joe Biden cannot do that because people know that it's not perfect, because he's not Donald Trump, and he's not going to simply bullshit. But so you have to capture that. We have accomplished a lot, but there's more to do, and we need to keep working together. And that's the challenge to Republicans. Are you actually going to work on your job, or are you going to simply continue to pitch a fit? And I think you got a partial answer to that last night.
Yeah, and that was one of my questions to you. And one of the most epic moments last night was when President Biden effectively cornered Republicans into admitting that they won't be slashing Social Security and Medicare, which was an absurd position in the first place. But I'm wondering, after last night, and based off of the reaction, because there were some really interesting reactions and moments when Speaker McCarthy seemed to be, not standing up, but clapping in a subtle way, and maybe acknowledging that some of what President Biden did was really significant. Do you think there's any room for any sort of bipartisanship? And I know President Biden mentioned two unique issues in America, which is gun violence and police brutality. But are there any issues that you think, after last night, based off of the reaction, that Democrats and Republicans can come together and work on?
Well, there ought to be. I mean, we have had bipartisan cooperation on a lot of issues historically, and in fact, in the last Congress. I think it would be naive to think that you're going to get that with Kevin McCarthy's House. Kevin McCarthy can't deliver any bipartisan compromise, and I think that's one of the things that was on display there. Kevin McCarthy, started the evening by, implying that he was going to be the adult in the room, telling Republicans, please do not misbehave. And then when they did, he just had to sit up there and kind of shush them. I mean, here's a guy who has hollowed himself out to become the speaker, and he was reduced to a spectator role. And what you had on display there was, he can make whatever deal he wants with Joe Biden, but he's not going to be able to deliver the caucus. Having said that, that's an important issue for Joe Biden to emphasize. And I think that there is an appetite among some of these disconnected voters that we were talking about before, they want people to work for the public good. They don't want them fighting all the time. These voters, want understand what the real problems of America are, and they want them to work together. One of the things that I did think was that I am seeing as an emerging bipartisan consensus is China policy, of all things. That one of the things we learned with the balloon was that there's no downside to being a China hawk. Politico had a really great piece about that the other day. The question is whether or not they will deal in good faith with that. And of course, that's always a question mark these days.
Right. And yesterday, Marjorie Taylor Greene sort of made a spectacle of herself by carrying this white balloon around Congress. And then during President
Deeply
Biden's speech,
serious.
what did she say? She said, China just spied on us. I mean, it was quite the moment.
I'm confused because I was reliably informed that she had matured. Remember, we were told that, she's learned her lesson. She's now a very serious person.
Yeah.
That was not on display yesterday. But Marjorie Taylor Greene understands, at least at some visceral reptilian level, that it's all about the show, the performance, the props. And anyone that thought that she had, grown past that, well, they were disabused of that. I mean, last year, she and Lauren Boebert were screaming at Joe Biden, and this year, well, she's replaying her greatest hit.
Unfortunately. So you mentioned this appetite from at least the American public for Congress to come together and work, and I think that's pretty evident in some of the polling. I'm wondering, for the Republican Party, why don't you think, or what is kind of their incentive for not working on those issues? Why are they so intent on doing these things that are clearly against what the American people want? Things like trying to impeach the Biden administration, their economic tax plan of raising basically a 30% tax rate on the sales tax. I'm wondering, why don't you think they do things that are in the American public's interest?
Well, because that's not what they're focused on right now. What they're focused on is the care and feeding of their base. Keep in mind that this generation of Republicans comes out of what I've described in my book as the perpetual outrage machine. And what they're doing is they're looking for ways to get clicks, to get contributions, to get social media engagement. So almost all the messaging that you're seeing from Donald Trump or DeSantis or Marjorie Taylor Greene, et cetera, is aimed at ginning up their own base, making sure that they are relevant on OAN and Newsmax and Fox News. So the problem for them, though, is that in this hermetically sealed world in which they're protected against criticism from the outside, they also have lost their immunity to crazy ideas. So in that bubble, for years, they've been talking about, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if we eliminated the income tax and we abolished the IRS and all we needed to do was to impose a fair tax? And on talk radio, people would go, yeah, that's a great idea. That's a wonderful idea. And nobody was in a position to sort of raise their hand at the back of the room and say, that's nuts. You're talking about a 30% sales tax. How will that play? And so that's a perfect example of how they've created a world in which they're almost speaking their own language to one another. And sometimes if you listen to Tucker Carlson, you need kind of a Rosetta Stone to figure out, what is he talking about? What are these issues? It's they have their own they have their own issues and characters and things that make no sense outside that bubble. So that, I think, disadvantages them in dealing with normie, disengaged, or independent voters.
That's super interesting. So the last question I have for you is, I think so much of this is setting up for 2024, and President Biden's kind of, I guess, prospects of getting anything done is pretty much slim to none with this Congress. But I'm wondering what you think are the most important things that President Biden can and maybe should focus on over these next 2 years to help him set up for 2024 and against this Republican House?
Well, you're right. I think that the chances of legislative victories are slim and none. So I think there's a couple of things that he has control over, and there are some things that he does not have control over. He does not have full control over the economy. A lot of his fate will be determined by what happens with inflation, what happens with jobs, what happens with the GDP. If there is, in fact, a soft landing, he's in pretty good shape. If we dip into a recession or inflation resurges, then we're in a very dangerous place. So he's got to keep focused on that. That's number one. Number two, and I just finished doing a podcast with my colleague A.B. Stoddard, and I think that he's got to keep his eye on Ukraine as well, because one of the narratives is going to be, is Joe Biden strong or is he weak? And the Republicans want to run against a weak Joe Biden. We also know that Donald Trump is going to be campaigning not as a dove. And by the way, I might write something about this, describing him as a dove. An apologist for a genocidal murderer like Vladimir Putin is not a dove. But he's got to make sure that the Ukrainians get everything they need to finish the job. Joe Biden is all in on Ukraine. If Ukraine fails, Joe Biden will fail. If Ukraine succeeds, then he will succeed. And I think that's something that he has more control over, ironically enough, than the economy.
Really interesting. Well, Charlie Sykes, I learn something from you every single time I hear you. Thank you for coming on and shedding some insight on what happened last night.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Well, that was always an interesting episode. It's always interesting to hear from Charlie Sykes, someone who is not afraid to speak his voice and to just really promote the facts. There's not much news after the post-State of the Union address, but I do want to talk about one thing, which is some reaction that we're seeing after the State of the Union. And so far, it's really, really positive. There was a CNN poll late last night, that basically exit polled a bunch of people. And I'm just going to read some of the numbers. And overall, those above the age of 18 thought that the president's speech was 72% of them thought the president's speech was positive. What was more interesting to me was there doesn't seem to be a divide among the traditional demographics. So if you think of, usually when you think of kind of polling, there seems to be a divide between younger and older folks. Yesterday, 69% of those under the age of 45 thought it was a positive speech. 73% of those above the age of 45 thought it was a positive speech. So only a 4% difference. So it's a pretty united reaction. Same thing with male-female. 68% of males thought it was positive. 76% of females thought it was positive. That's pretty close. 64% of white people thought it was positive. 85% of people of color thought it was positive. That's, a little bit further apart, but still relatively close when it comes to, trying to attract an audience. And then you have 71% of non-college educated folks, 72% of college educated folks thinking that it was a positive speech. And then 73% of people versus 71% of people making under the $50,000 a year versus above $50,000 a year. So you see a pretty united reaction, which is pretty extraordinary for a State of the Union address. And it seems like a lot of people are catching on. I thought yesterday, like I said in the introduction, what President Biden was able to do last night was pretty extraordinary for a State of the Union speech against such a divided Congress. And one of the things that I was paying close attention to was whether or not he would speak directly to the American people. And I thought it was during those moments that were most effective, when he looked, the camera directly into the eye, when he looked the American public directly into the eye and spoke to their concerns. He empathized with their concerns. He recognized their struggles. And that is when you saw, I think, the best of Joe Biden and his character, because fundamentally he's someone who is able to relate to loss and struggle and grief and pain in a way that few people are able to. And so I thought those moments were really effective. So we'll see what happens in these days to come with the reaction to the State of the Union. The other thing is today, Ron Klain just released his last tweet. So of course, Ron Klain was the chief of staff as of about 10 minutes ago or 20 minutes ago. And now he is an ordinary citizen. Now Jeff Zients will take over post State of the Union, and we're going to see, I suspect, probably a new kind of functioning administration, one that really tries to focus on what we can do against this divided Congress. And so we'll all be paying attention to that. That's all the news I have for you today. Hope you enjoyed this episode with Charlie Sykes, and share this episode with anyone who might be interested in listening to Gen Z perspectives. It's really important now more than ever before. Yesterday, Joe Biden made that clear by talking about a lot of the issues most important to young people as well as the nation. So we'll be here every day at 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time on youtube.com/Politicon. You don't want to miss that. Tomorrow, we're going to have on Jennifer Massero, who's going to talk about rhetoric and propaganda. So do not miss that. And then on Friday, we're going to have on Molly Jong Fast, who's going to talk about the news of the week this week. She is someone who really isn't afraid to voice her opinion, and someone who I think is very fair in terms of how she assesses things. So do not miss that. She's a great writer, great podcaster, great speaker. We'll be back again 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, right here. Please have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.